They were different ways to evaluate what you did, and you felt no less affirmed or achieved because these worlds had a certain sort of confidence or they stood for something that you really wanted to be a part of. Now, because arts in general and literature is a profession, everything is done to a certain level, but things stand out less. I feel in this new generation a great awareness of what is happening now and a slight sort of impatience with the past. I sort of feel where I exist doesn't exist anymore.
You really fell into quite a moment in time
Yes, that's
and,
very true.
yeah,
I
entangled a
think
lot of
about that a
lives.
lot.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Love and Philosophy. Today, my guest is Darryl Pinckney. I've been thinking about my New York years a lot recently, and in so doing, I went back and read a book I've been meaning to read the last couple of years, actually, Come Back in September, which is Darryl's book. I've read all his other books. I've known him for a while. He's an incredible writer. But the reason I went back to this book was because I was thinking about New York and this time when I was a young student and trying to be a poet, I guess, and sort of idolized a lot of people from the New York School of Poets era or the Beats era or what I think of as the New York Review of Books era, which is Darryl's era, and he was part of it. A lot of the women I was reading, for example, like Susan Sontag and Elizabeth Hardwick, Darryl was, one might say, best friends with. He met them when he was a young student at Columbia University and became close to them. And the book is about that. Come Back in September, so I'll let you read it. But it's this group of people like Jim Jarmusch and Nan Goldin and, of course, Elizabeth Hardwick, Elizabeth Bishop, Barbara Epstein, Robert Lowell. Darryl's also worked with the playwright Robert Wilson. You'll hear him talk about Lizzie here. He's talking about Elizabeth Hardwick, and Robert is Robert Lowell. These are all sort of famous writers and poets that a lot of people almost mythologized, I guess, in the early 2000s and still do now. A really somewhat tragic, but also just incredibly intelligent, creative, rather radical period of time in literature and poetry. And I idolized it back then. We all sort of did, thinking there was this group of people that we wanted to recreate or be like. So I've just been thinking of that a bit, and that's why I read Darryl's book, and I'm so glad I did and got to have this wonderful conversation with him. And I'd also just by chance watched this film, All the Beauty and the Bloodshed. Maybe you've seen it, about Nan Goldin, and Darryl appears in there a few times. But in any case, it sort of comes back to this theme I think of a lot, and you probably hear me talk about a lot, about trying to hold the paradox. Because this time period in my life was glorious, really wonderful, and also really painful and really hard. And in a way, these literary movements are that same feeling of holding that beauty and that pain. And this film about Nan Goldin really expresses it, and Darryl expresses it well in his writing, though almost in spite of himself. But it was healing to talk to him and to revisit his work, because I realized he's already holding the paradox, so to speak, within him and within his writing are all these streams and rivers from so many places that have inspired me. That's kind of what we get to by the end, is realizing, trying to express to him that I see all these threads in him and that somehow it's incredibly meaningful. It's a reason for writing, which is why I'm bringing it up, because even though there's all this pain and challenge in it, and maybe it is mythologized in a way, there is a real transmission that takes place through literature. When I think back to those years, which were hard but also beautiful, literature and poetry really got me through them in a way. And I know I'm not alone in that experience. A lot of people have felt that way. All of which to say, I'm just sending some gratitude to Darryl and to all of these people, many of whom have now gone, who wrote and took risks and put themselves out there and made themselves vulnerable. It's not easy to write and take chances, and it's no wonder that it can often cause some heartache. But in any case, I do think it's worth it, is the point. And Darryl sometimes says, is it really worth it to write another book? Do we really need another book? And I think the answer is yes, we do. I'm so glad he wrote Come Back in September, and I hope you'll look at it. Also, Black Deutschland is a really good book. Another one that was important to me with all the time I spent in Berlin. I'm rambling on, and it's fitting because Darryl and I talked a lot before I finally hit the record button. So this just sort of starts right in the middle of things, but we quickly get to a lot of these themes I've already brought up. So I'll put links in the show notes to all his books, and okay, here we go. Why are you less inclined to just let everything go?
I think in some cases or on some issues, it's because I don't find where I'm standing adds anything to what's going on. I don't feel it has much impact.
That sounds
and
sort
I
of
don't know
sad.
if that's a function of age.
Yeah.
Well, for instance, I was away during the Columbia demonstrations, but I was really offended that the administration went to such lengths to arrest students. That's not what they're supposed to do. And it went with this climate of being intimidated by a House committee that has no business in how a university governs itself. They're not answerable to Congress. Congress doesn't fund even large research institutions. So I thought that was really not upholding the Columbia sort of traditions. I was really disappointed. At the same time, you can always find at any demonstration someone who will confirm whatever the worst aspect of the story you want to give it. It sort of brought me back to the days of student rhetoric and being overboard. But then Hamilton Hall was my place. Breaking Glass didn't seem to me 1968. It seemed to me rather January 6th. So I felt very kind of alienated from that sort of tactic, which brought back the days when I was alienated from that sort of tactic.
Yeah, it reminds me of your book. And actually what you're saying reminds me of, it's not in the book, but for some reason, or somewhere I remember you saying, or reading or mentioning that, I don't know if I have this right, but that the way James Baldwin wrote was to just give it all or throw it all out the window. No, that's not right. It was like to give everything you have. There was some phrase.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Throw it
Well,
all
he
over the
did.
fence or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he certainly did,
Because I associate that with some other conversation I think we've had about what we were saying before I started recording about giving it your all, or
Yes.
just, saying
but
what's
I
on your
also
mind.
feel it's slightly generational. I don't want to be the guy always saying in my day or sort of correcting. I mean, people have to make their own mistakes, really. And so just as you're willing to let the city belong to another generation, in a way, this particular issue where it stands now has taken on a generational character that I wasn't aware of until it happened. And maybe the way we were brought up with it was also generational, since a couple of my closest friends had survivors in their families. And this was the first generation that, was going to summer camp in Israel, that sort of thing. And so you just grew up, especially where I lived, and what was socially possible.
It sounds like you were more careful though, because I heard you saying at some time you used to be less careful, but actually having read this book, Come Back in September, where you're actually a little bit careful in there. I mean, okay. I mean, first we should say hi, Darryl. It's great to see you.
It's good to see you.
Thank you for coming and talking to me today for Love and Philosophy.
Thank you for digging me up and talking to me again. It's always
I love talking to you. You know that.
Yeah. Same here. Same here.
And there's actually too much I want to talk to you about, so that's the problem. But
that's fine.
It's good we just jumped in.
So do you mean careful in the way of careful from the point of view of now? or that that guy was careful back then?
Well, there's like it's both way, it's both and not and neither because I feel like there was a place maybe where you had to be careful, but you were also resisting or getting away from that and going to New York, right? Like,
Oh,
I
yes.
mean, that was what that
Yeah,
was
that
about
was the whole
too.
story.
But in certain parts of the country, most parts of the country, or certain like you had to sort of be. I
Back
don't know. You didn't
then,
have to be, but you were fighting it. But I don't know that tension is
back
what I'm trying to
then,
bring up.
one of the things that made New York interesting, it had a rather bad reputation in the rest of America. And it
Mm-hmm.
was a place where a lot of people came to save themselves by sort of being themselves. So the town
I
was
just
full of
yeah.
weirdos,
Mm.
and it was affordable in that way. So it was also much more of an adventure for a young person who, you know, nice thing about being socially stupid is that it gives you a fearlessness that you don't really have.
Well, that's the whole youth
So,
is wasted on the young thing, right?
but no, but
No.
no, I mean, we did things that we can't believe we did, but we did them,
Yeah.
and in a kind of innocence or belief that the world was sort of on your side.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So it's not wasted. It's a bad
no,
word to be in a phrase.
no, it's not wasted.
Yeah.
So,
When did you come to New York exactly? At 19.
1972.
So it was 72. Okay.
Yeah. And so, it was very much in the aftermath of 68. It was a sort of big complex people had about not being as cool as the people from 68. Some of you, and there were sort of figures from that time still very much around.
Mm-hmm.
And the thinking of that time was still sort of very much in the air. It's just that suddenly, probably not so suddenly, it wasn't. And I think it had to do with the draft ending, the war ending,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly this odd period that the civil rights movement went into of, being trying what happens after this kind of mass movement, what is how are the politics of change made part of the system. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess that happened in the 70s, which was why people disliked Carter so much, because it was, in a
It was
way,
like
a
a
second
return.
Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
But I think also importantly, that second wave of feminism really sort of broke through. And for me, in the form of introducing all this writing I had no idea about.
Yeah.
So that was a big deal because, we were very into the avant garde,
Which
historically
at that
and
time, what was
contemporary.
it exactly? Because
Good
was it?
question.
Yeah.
you know, Good question. There were several, and they were historical, so it was a kind of model for judging where you were or placing yourself or defining what your sort of work would be about.
So when you were in
Uh,
Indiana before you went to New York, who was it you were dreaming of? I know Sylvia Plath, right? But when you thought of New York, was there what were you thinking of the beach? Were you thinking of Frank O'Hara already
no,
then, or was it
no, I
more
didn't know
just
about Frank
the
O'Hara
city? Oh, you
until I
didn't.
got to New
Okay.
York. No, I
Okay.
didn't. I had never heard of the New York Post.
Okay.
Um, and Plath was just a kind of, probably a real gay thing since she was a suicide.
Is that a gay thing? Suicides?
Well,
Do I not know
tragic
that?
woman. It's like Judy
Yeah,
Garland.
the tragic woman. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
Right. Okay.
that sort of thing.
Hmm. Not
Um,
necessarily suicide, but
but
it's
she was
also
also,
a girl
well,
thing. And I mean,
no,
I
that was a
had it
big
too.
part of things then, you
Okay.
know,
I didn't know that.
this kind of early death.
I
Text
thought
of
of
the
that reading your
war.
book, that like that play of illness, death, life, like that razor edge border.
But,
Yeah.
earlier, because of the war, it had a different meaning
Okay.
that youth was, I mean, here, youth culture was aware of itself and not that aware of how transitory or transitory fleeting
Yeah.
is as a
Mm.
category.
Mm.
Because in America, it goes on forever, and then one day
Yeah.
it's not there anymore.
Yeah.
But there were sort of the rock stars and people like that, romantic figures who who died, who were sort of sacrifices. And of course, the politics of the time were full of these sacrifices.
Right. That was kind of the
So,
60s, right? With everyone,
yeah, 60s
Janis
and
Joplin.
70s.
I mean, you could just name
Yeah,
so many people that were
exactly.
so young.
Yeah.
James Dean, all that.
So that was a big part of it. But then also in the 70s, you could meet the founders of various avant-garde. They were still alive and running around New York.
Like who? I mean, did you have somebody in mind? Because you ended up being friends with who, for me, was the avant-garde, or for my generation, right? Like coming to New York, working in bookshops, whatever, 20
yeah.
years later, that whole crowd was. So I'm trying to think. I mean, we were still obsessed with the Beats and Frank O'Hara and that whole scene too, but I'm just trying to figure out
Well,
if
Frank
you had
O'Hara
someone in
hadn't
mind
been
or.
dead that long when I came to New York.
Okay.
And I had David Shapiro and Kenneth Koch as professors, and
Oh,
they were
wow.
friends. Kenneth Koch
Mm-hmm.
was a friend of his,
Mm-hmm.
and Ashbery was around. So, and they were certainly thought of themselves as an avant-garde and their connection to sort of painting. David Shapiro was a really wonderful teacher. Um, uh, for one thing, he was so close to our age. And, he just was full of things I didn't know, you know. And he would say, let's go. And the next thing you know, you're at sort of Larry Rivers' studio at a party and you're holding the ashtray for sort of Warhol, who of course you're not going to speak to.
Yeah,
Um,
just hold the
but
ashtray
he was
for him.
very
That's
kind of
wild. For Andy
generous with
Warhol.
his, yeah, he was very generous with the idea that New York was this intellectual adventure. And so that was a big deal. And there was a lot happening in music and theater and dance um, all the time.
Yeah.
Something was going on. I always liked the city for mm, grubby, urban,
Mm-hmm.
sort of fantasies. That
Mm-hmm.
you're a kid sitting in Indianapolis, Indiana, and New York seems a bit sort of dangerous, and people stay up late, and the kind of
Yeah.
people you don't know, and you would like
Yeah.
to, So that was always a big part of it.
For some reason, I had this
Um,
image you kind of dipped into it at some point with your family when you were young or something and had gotten the feel for it or wanted to go back. Maybe I just made that up in my head.
no, I went
Oh,
to the New York World's Fair in 1964.
oh, okay.
And so, what had been on
Wow.
television was made real. And yeah, it made an enormous impression on me. There's actually not been other places I've wanted to live. I can understand Los Angeles, but
Hmm.
poor San Francisco has always seemed to me just a kind of not exactly another version of New
I
York
have
at
never
all.
wanted to live in San Francisco either. I always go
No,
there thinking, okay, this time I'm going to feel it. I'm going to understand why everyone talk.
no,
I've never felt it either.
it's
I'm almost
beautiful.
ashamed to say that sometimes, but it's
No,
the same.
it's beautiful, but
Oh yeah, it's
I have
definitely beautiful.
no interest in
No, I don't vibe with it. I don't
it.
like
No,
crave it like New York.
no, no, no. But now, New York is different once again, and it would be odd if a city hadn't changed in 50 years. I find the strange thing is that avant-garde got bought out by um, the bourgeois lifestyle. So Lower East Side, East Village,
Yeah. Everyone wanted
$200
to be avant-garde,
t-shirts.
so then the
Yeah.
avant-garde became
No, everyone wanted to
too
be hip.
bourgeois. Yeah.
Everyone wanted to be hip.
It's
But
kind of
it
yeah.
cost a fortune to be hip. A plain wooden table is so expensive. And a sort of, very ornate sort of thing that you could
Yeah.
get at a country house sale isn't. And this is where taste is at the moment. Minimalism, uh, because you can't make a mistake.
Hmm.
And I think the city's full of people who don't want to make a mistake stylistically, which is too bad because a lot of the eccentricity of the city just visually is gone. Not that I had much visual sense. Street corners have changed, and I can't remember what was there.
Hmm.
These sort of new buildings. It depends. Places where I spent a lot of time. I haven't been to 48th and 8th in a long time, since
Oh,
before the pandemic, and I was there recently, and that was a big shock because the corners are all different. And since there was a restaurant, there is still a restaurant there where I used to go a lot. It's a corner I sort of that is imprinted on my memory, and it's completely changed.
is that
Very
where the
strange.
bar is that I can't remember the name of
No,
right now? No.
no, this was actually a good restaurant called Orso,
Oh, Orso.
where people
Okay.
would go
Yeah.
after the theater, and so I was taken there a lot.
Oh, yeah.
But it had, like a parking lot and a sort of fragile, strange old building that maybe had once been a movie theater, and then this and that were there. But that kind of ghostly New York is gone. The
Mm.
ghost of an earlier era has
Mm.
been sort of developed. So because you always walked around New York and you could sort of feel its past. And I'm sure you can now also, because the architecture or this and that. But at street level, it's very changed, I find.
I was kind of shocked
A lot of
reading your
chains,
chained or chains?
chain
Chains, like
stores,
chains. Oh,
chain stores,
yeah, yeah.
Starbucks
Chain
everywhere
stores. Okay. Yeah.
instead of a
That's what I
diner.
was about to say. I was kind of surprised that you were talking about the lower or like the East Village below Union Square and Lower East Side and stuff. And you were saying that even like in the Lower East Side, it wasn't there weren't cafes everywhere and stuff. It was pretty dark and
Yeah, yeah.
you kind of
You,
try to get from one light to the next or something.
yes. You could hear sort of people having sort of rooster fights in the sort of backyards and things like that.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
Where was the book? You didn't work for Bob and Terry, did you, at the bookshop? You said two guys with ponytails in the book, but it wasn't the pre St. Mark's bookshop, was it?
No, no, no.
Okay.
The bookshop where I worked was 89th and Broadway.
Oh, for some reason I thought it was downtown. Okay.
Lucy worked at the Strand,
Yeah, right.
and
Who was Luke back then?
right. And I never worked at St. Mark's, though. That was the coolest place going, completely.
Well,
Um,
that's where
yeah,
I worked when I was a kid, or like coming to school. That's where I worked, and that's how I
yeah.
discovered, for example, Elizabeth Hardwick
Oh
or
yeah.
Darryl Pinckney. Yes,
Oh well.
because we had the New York Review, and that's where we
Yeah,
always had those books, and like that was
yeah.
that feeling that you show in the book of being kind of obsessed with. It feels like such a small world now in a way because I've gone so far out of it. But at the same time, it feels like all the world still, where you're just everything is about kind of what's being written about in those like the New York Review of Books or the New Yorker or what poetry is coming out or what little weird book that you didn't know that now you're going to discover and it's going to change your life. Like, for example, Sleepless Nights was for a lot of us back then, or you made me feel that again. And
Oh, that's
it's
good.
so rich.
You're very kind. I mean, uh, there were different forms of success back then, and um, I don't think people should be uh, hypocritical about uh, making money. I can remember feeling that people were a little mean about the group because it had been a bestseller more than anything. It's not a terrible, trashy novel by any means. And it really, I think, probably hurt Mary McCarthy's feelings. At least that's what I remember Lizzie and sort of Bob saying, because the review made fun of the group. But that was a kind of snobbery about the bestseller.
Which bothers
Um,
me. But I also, I
yeah.
mean, I felt that so much when I was young. I don't know if you did, but I think it messed me up a bit. I mean, not only with the writing in New York, where you feel like you're supposed to be, you can't sell out or something. I mean, the whole thing around the beats and around even John, even like, yeah, all of it. I think Kenneth Coke and John Ashbery were more away from that, but it still felt like all of that was about you have to be authentic, and somehow that got related to don't make a lot of money and have a bestseller. Same with music,
Exactly.
right, at the time. And
Yeah.
it's completely crazy.
But it's
Um,
it's a it's a con of Bohemia that goes back to Paris in the 1830s. Because I'm poor, I'm more real, or
yeah.
I'm pure,
But it hurts
and
people, I think.
Bohemia actually, I can't remember the history I read, but it's actually Bohemia is sort of an elevator up, you know. It's not a socially static zone by any means.
Yeah.
And a lot of these success stories of the period we're talking about sort of illustrate this. But I think it's also got something in it that Mary was a woman.
Mm.
Nobody ever said that Norman Mailer had copped out because
Oh,
uh,
really?
his
Oh,
novel
gosh.
was a bestseller, right?
Mm.
No,
I thought he got it too. He didn't get it too.
no, no. Um, the model that the literary world, I think, still follows is Hemingway and Fitzgerald, this kind of early promise, early success,
Mm.
and, this sort of financial independence that goes with it. I still think this is the model for the world of literary fiction. It's just the world of literary fiction is probably, when you go in a bookstore now, and young adult fiction is a huge section, and the graphic novels is a huge section, and anime is a huge section, and literary fiction is there. It is, but uh, it's not as, I guess there have always been genre of fiction, that sort of thing. But there was not making any sense.
Yes, you are. It's really hard to talk
Publishers,
about because I'm thinking, because here's the thing, right? Okay, I'm going to just talk about my own experience because, and
okay,
you can tell me, but as like a 20s, early 20s, right? I'm in school. I'm kind of half living in Europe, but working at the bookshop when I can, trying to make money. And you have this idea you want to be like the author that everyone wants to read, right? Like you're driven by that. You're reading every night. You're taking like spending all your money on books. And then at the same time, that's kind of the sellout in a way, because to do that, you have to do kind of what I think you're saying, which is write this formula book, which then gets processed in a certain way. It's kind of transitioned, right? Where you try to get some kind of huge contract to write a book and then you get a lot of press. And that's really different from that feeling I'm trying to describe of this like arty thing that you describe in your book, where it's this life gritty, you're living the art. Those things have
well,
somehow gotten, I don't
that
know
was
how to
our
reconcile that.
I there was a body of a world where that was success, or that
Yeah.
was the dedication.
And it's still the dream,
And
right? It's even
I
why
don't
people want
know.
New York.
Nobody, I mean, it's hard enough to write was the idea, but that whole kind of thing, assumptions had a lot of confidence behind them. And I don't know if the world of literary fiction has the same confidence that it did then. Possibly because, for one thing, literature isn't sacred anymore. It's a profession. So
It's
that's too
about
bad.
it's about people instead of, I don't know, this might be idealizing it, but even when I read your book, and of course some of this is just hindsight and telling a story, but I felt like I always looked at these groups, right, of people who would go and talk about ideas and try to create stuff together. And of course there's a lot of bad stuff in that, and illness. Like I could tell the story in a negative way, but the point is there was this spirit that kind of bled into everything that you wanted to be part of. And now it's more about you become an individual bestseller or something. That's like way too generalized, but in your
No, I
book it
understand
feels
what you're,
like there's a
I know what
group.
you're, I sort of know what you're saying. I guess I'm trying to say they were different ways to evaluate what you did. And you felt no less, sort of affirmed or achieved, by the fact that it was only in this world or that world, because these worlds had a certain sort of confidence, or they stood for something that you really wanted to be a part of. Now, these things, because arts in general and literature is sort of a profession, everything is done to a certain level, but things stand out less. and there's much more of it as the reading population declines. And so I feel in this sort of new generation a great awareness of what is happening now, and a slight sort of impatience with the past, or certainly with the values of the past, and especially the critical values of the past. Um, and also, it affects this idea of sort of traditions and sort of where your work stands in a line, because that sense, I think, goes. And so people sort of think that success strikes by lightning,
Mm-hmm.
and they're
Mm-hmm.
all waiting for their big chance.
Yeah.
And that's
Big
the only
break.
thing that matters, is that you hit it big. The
Mm-hmm.
rest, isn't there. It's sort of like a children's drawing. There's blue sky up here, green down at the bottom, and nothing in between. And this loss of the in between, I think, is sort of to the detriment of literary New York. For one thing, it may still be the capital of print culture, but print culture itself is, not sure what it is anymore anyway, because its business models
It's
don't
all
seem to
changing.
be working.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think
I'm
that's a
not on
wonderful way to
social
say it.
media.
Yeah. Especially the
Sorry.
children's drawing. It does feel like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But
So,
yeah.
I sort of feel where I exist doesn't exist anymore.
I think
Um,
people want it. I really think like you were talking about the bookshop when you go in, you see the youth side and the all these things. That's where they're getting that feeling. I think that
really, yeah.
people still want it. It's just that now we kind of get it in a slightly
It's a different genre,
it's a different
you know.
genre. But I think
Uh,
people still
hey.
crave what you had, even if it's kind of a dream. And it still is the fuel for why, I don't know if we were on camera yet or not. We were talking about New York's or become sort of bourgeois and
Mhm.
like it's not the same anymore. And actually, that's because people wanted to experience exactly that, what you were kind of going through. But now it's become somehow rarefied, or it's not even, I don't know, maybe it's there in different ways, but
No, it's
everything's too expensive.
just, yes. I think that, you know, um, young entrepreneurs didn't feel they had to become um, square like their parents in that old beat word
Mm-hmm.
anymore. That they weren't. Also, a lot of money people think they're creative. That's another problem.
But I was just thinking about like the New York Review where you were working and you had all these mentors that were this thing that we're talking about, these poets and writers and critics and this kind of group of people who, yes, it was kind of small and insular, but it was New York and it actually was kind of the scene in the world. I mean, it's it's taught in schools and stuff now. So, but you were in this scene and you talk about it and how it felt like you had a kind of, I don't think you used the word family, but you say you were part of something, Or I feel like that's kind of missing in the literary world, but
Well,
people crave it still.
I don't know if, say, in magazine life, where a lot of stuff is by Zoom, if there is this office life anymore, because that's what that was, a kind of office life.
And a kind of
And
mentorship too,
well,
because
and the
you know,
contributors, more than that, it was the sort of contributors dropping in, and it was the ease of dialogue
mm.
between older and younger that has changed a lot, I think. Because, I wanted to talk to these older figures and to hear what they had to say. I mean, I suppose you could sort of see them as mentors. Uh, but firstly, they were friends, and that's where the honor of knowing them came into things. That I mean, friendships between different ages
Yeah,
um,
definitely it was friendship. I
was a
think mentor was the
category.
wrong word, but I was thinking more
No,
about
I
at the
understand.
review than
Mentor,
with
certainly
Elizabeth.
they printed me. So what else is that?
Yeah, but I think after maybe it was kind of, I mean, this was like a lifetime once you met her for the rest of her life. We're talking about Elizabeth Hardwick, for example, which
Yeah,
is kind of
yeah.
the sun in which the planets revolve around in the book, in a way,
yes.
you know.
Later on, she would sort of say she was furious that I moved to England, that I didn't
I'm
stay
sure
in New
she
York,
was. I mean,
you know.
yeah.
Well,
But I guess like I was gonna ask you, do you
she
think
didn't like England so much.
she didn't like what?
England so much.
Did she come visit ever?
She visited Lowell when he lived there, yes.
But yeah. But you didn't move there till,
About 88.
oh gosh,
No,
it was,
1990.
oh well.
1990. So the book ends in 1981 and it has this postscript that's just 1989
Yeah, I know.
because
It's so,
everyone's dead. But
yeah, there's so
uh,
much, like I think the word death comes like 20 times in the last 20 pages or something. And
they all
then,
died.
yeah, but also it makes me think of New York, and that was kind of a huge changing year, right? Like
Yeah.
with AIDS and
It's one of the reasons
yeah.
lots of people left
Yeah. Is
AIDS.
it why you left, or was it James, or
I didn't know James then.
okay.
I mean, I knew his poetry certainly, but yes, I mean, it was a combination of things. For one thing, my father had to sell the apartment I was living in.
That's such a cool
So,
scene when he comes with the deed. I was
no,
totally not expecting that either, by the
he
way.
was really crazy. So it was really
I love that.
sad. And it sounds much more glamorous than it was, but prices back then were a whole different thing.
Yeah.
Um, but it meant that I sort of could be very casual about employment. There's always somebody backing you. Uh, well, often there's somebody backing
Hmm.
because there are people who've not had anyone.
Hmm.
Um, so that was a part of it. Um, I also got sober. That was a big part of it.
Okay.
And
So
then
the Black Deutschland kind of, I always wondered if that was in any way true.
experientially true, but very different in the story.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Black
It
Deutschland is
wasn't the drug
completely
thing, but
made up. The only thing
okay.
that's real is Berlin. You
Yeah.
know,
But
um,
just that pilgrimage of like getting kind of starting a new life while
that's true.
sober in a different way. That's what I
That's true.
wondered about.
That was true.
Yeah.
Um, um, and yes, and then of course, yes, AIDS because so many people sort of had died, and um, I remember nights when one sort of kept on doing drugs because the space that would have been taken up by the luck or bad luck of meeting someone didn't exist anymore. At least not for me. I wasn't sort of going home with anyone. Um, in This was 1985. That's when it
So
was really
yeah, so you mean
scary.
like, because you talk in the book, I love that too, that you feel in New York. I mean, I think it's very special in New York where that you don't know what's going to happen at night. I mean, even like Andy, we're all using the ashtray as you hold it, or all these kind of weird things happen, right? I mean, it's happened to
Yeah,
me too, and during that time in the 70s when you're around all these people. But so that, and also that, like, who you're going to meet, and there was this kind of very erotic, romantic, mixed up with all the everything that was going on spirit. But you're
yeah.
saying that kind of everyone then had to just stop all, like you can't, that part of it was
No,
gone,
a
or
lot of it sort of was going on, but for me, it seemed a very darker, much darker scene,
yeah, yeah,
and I was afraid.
yeah, of course.
So, um, the
It's terrifying.
bars were less fun, uh, if that's where most of your gay life had been taking place, as mine was. So, you know,
So fill it with drinking or more drugs or something
yeah,
instead of the
exactly.
other high. Yeah,
Instead of brotherhood,
yeah, yeah.
or brotherhood became a form of sort
Must have been terrifying. It's hard.
vigil,
It's hard to think about that
vigil.
time.
On
There's
for
so much spirit there. It's hard
years.
to imagine what was it like when it was happening as it was happening. It must have been terrifying, you know.
Well, really terrifying, lonely,
Oh,
stigmatizing,
yeah.
everything one could read in a book or see in a film is true. And it went on for quite a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I think it wasn't until the 90s that they had some cocktail that extended life. Um, but in the early mid 80s, it was really because you had sort of a culture that was so hostile to it. And
Yeah.
I had a roommate, a former roommate from college, whose mother was a noted sex therapist on TV.
Uh,
And her whole rap was that it was a punishment for,
oh,
abnormality, blah, blah,
oh
blah.
gosh.
And that was around a lot more than,
Mm.
I mean, living with that on top of everything anyway
Yeah, especially
was
because you
really
kind
hard.
of came to New York. That in part, wasn't it, to have that freedom and privacy?
Yeah.
Yeah, and now it was kind
Yeah.
of being, I don't know, a
It
story
was
being
it
told
was a
about it that
blight.
wasn't true.
It was a blight. It was, yeah, it's really, really bad.
So that's when you went to England for that.
No, I went to Berlin.
Okay, that's what I thought. I thought you said
Yeah.
England. That's why I was confused. That's why I
Well, we
said,
lived
was
in
it?
England when I met James in Berlin. He'd
Okay.
come back from the Far East and had this farm where he was starting this garden, and the garden absorbed more of his attention, and he didn't want to keep coming to Berlin. So I came to Oxford,
Okay.
and
I
that
kept
was sort of
waiting in the
that.
book for you to tell the story of meeting him because you kind of mentioned like, oh yeah, I think it's when you're talking about Susan Sontag at first, and you're like,
Yeah,
who would introduce me later
she did.
to James?
She
But then it
did.
never, I never, because I don't think I've ever really heard the story of how exactly
When
you
Susan
two
was
met.
writing the Volcano Lover, she was in Berlin, the sort of DAAD apartment, you know, and I saw her often, and then every day. She took me to dinner to the same place every day.
Oh.
And on like the 31st day, she said, I can't have dinner with you. I'm having dinner with James Fenton. And I thought, instead
Oh,
of
what?
thank you for being so sweet to me night after penniless night, I just thought, well, who am I? Why can't I meet James Fenton? Because I'd read him, Seamus Haney wrote this sort of glowing review of Children in Exile in the New York Review. So I'd read the book. Then the next day, she didn't say anything. And I knew Susan well enough to guess this meant something didn't go well.
Hmm.
I remember she was due to meet Arvo Pärt, and I think did, but she never talked about it. That's two people I can't really see quite. I'm not surprised she didn't say anything.
Huh.
Anyway, so after a while, she said, you know what he did? He read the newspaper. And he would explain to me eventually that he was traveling with a young Filipino photographer who revered Susan. And he knew that if he didn't make her talk to him, she wouldn't. So at the beginning of the meal, he opened a newspaper and she had to talk to this guy. And then he
Wow.
closed the newspaper and then they proceeded to have the
Very
meal.
smart.
And then
But
she
I'm
said,
sure she wasn't happy
there
about that.
he is. And he was sitting in the Paris bar with this Filipino photographer a few tables away, and she introduced us. It took a couple of days
Days, that's
to,
all.
yeah,
Was it
days.
like love at first sight, or was it just fascination, or is
No,
there
I
a
mean,
such
he
thing
had
as
these
love at
sort of
first sight?
big eyes and sort of hairy hands, and he was a real poet. Um, I never got over this thing I have for have had for poets. This was my big campus thing, poets.
I had this idea I was going to ask you if you think in poetry,
No, I don't.
because you kind of write
Alas.
like it and you kind of talk like it. There's something
No,
very,
I like a failed poet. Oh no,
no, not a failed
no,
poet, but
no, no. But you know what I mean.
I do.
It
Yeah.
was a big. I sort of yes, and there's so much I haven't read that it's very hard for me to move on to the poetry of the present moment because I'm still thinking about what I never got around to reading. You think there'll be time, and then one day you realize, oh, but that doesn't make you kind of get off
And the thing for
the
poetry for me
Criterion
is you want to read it
channel that
again.
early.
You know, I don't know if you do, but there's certain people, certain poets,
There's
certain
certain people.
that it changes. So when you're in a different place in life and you read it,
Frank
it's like
O'Hara,
reading. Yeah.
he doesn't change.
Hmm.
He doesn't change, but it calls me back to that time and that freedom of verse, Frank O'Hara. I don't reread Ashbery anymore.
I haven't read him in a long
Um,
time either. I just hadn't thought
there
of him
was
until
so
I read your
much of
book.
it, and when David Shapiro died, I looked at, started to read a book of his, and I ended up reading Frank O'Hara, because that's who told me about Frank O'Hara was David Shapiro.
What did you read? Which one do you go back to? I
And
mean,
Frank O'Hara,
yeah.
the
I
last one was, do you remember the days when we were still first rate? And
oh
every
yeah.
day began with the big apple in its hog mouth. That one.
Oh yeah. I
It's,
like the
it's
yeah.
called Animals. So, and
You reference a few
uh,
in the book too. The movie star one, I can't remember it right now, but
yeah,
and lunch
yeah,
stuff. And I love the
yeah.
one, I can't remember what it's called now, about the ship. Here I am with my Polish rudder in my hand, and like I can't, something
Yes,
about always waiting for the ship to come back into the shore, or I don't know.
yeah.
Some
No, there are a lot of them, and
yeah. But those change for me too when I read them again, but they are very
yeah.
of a time.
Yes, and then it's nice to have a sort of new experience. I did another Robert Wilson piece about Pessoa, Portuguese writer, about whom I knew nothing. I mean, really, pretty much nothing,
Hmm.
except that he weirdly had 100 pseudonyms or something like that. And by the end of the piece, by the premiere, I had sort of very high regard for his poetry, and I'm glad that I had that time with it. Whether or not I'll read it again soon, I doubt, you know, that kind of thing. Um, and there are also things I always mean to reconsider, because I think in my youth I was at such a high horse about poetry, especially. That's, I think, that sort of New York Review Lowell thing, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
I was very sort of free verse in my real life, but very influenced by certain critics in critical life. What am I saying?
But there wasn't a
I
snobbiness
want to
there,
go
or there
back
was.
and sort of give things a second chance that I used to be very snobbish about,
Okay, right.
particularly someone like Gwendolyn Brooks,
Oh,
um, because she means so much to Terence Hayes, a poet I do have regard for, and people like that.
I always liked Gwendolyn Brooks. The Chicago sort of
Yeah.
feeling, but that
Well, I
didn't
always
go, yeah, well with what you were involved with with the
no, I made a
Lowell.
distinction between the early Brooks and then the Brooks that changed her mind and went with Black Power,
Mm,
you know. Um, and that's the Brooks that people respond to now.
mm,
Just as the Baldwin I always thought of as, this angry ending. People start with him now. That's the Baldwin who rings for them, the one who's run out of patience and isn't so pretty anymore.
yeah, it all sort of goes together though, doesn't it? I mean,
I'm afraid so.
the transition and the
Yeah.
trying to live it, and yeah.
Yes.
Do you think we are who we know? And I mean that in a kind of deep way, because like thinking about your book and
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. Sure. Yes. And that includes family that you got along with or didn't get along with. There are people you know. Lizzie used to advise people, write about your families because you don't know it, but they're already characters in your
Hmm.
heads. And if you're afraid to write about your family, then you can't. be a fiction writer.
You think that's true?
No, because I think there's different kinds of fiction, but I understood what she meant, which is, don't be sentimental. Um,
And there's something about being able to write about your family, which does free you in a way. I mean, if you get to the point where you can live with your family in your imagination in a way, I think it's a different place to be in. Not an easy
I think
place to be in, I would say.
no, I think a lot of things, I think my family would have been hurt by a lot of things had I said them then. Definitely.
Yeah, I felt that in the book that you're kind of hiding. I mean, not
Big
I mean,
time.
you couldn't show them who you were,
No,
but at the same time, they were very
elected
proud of
not
you for
to.
doing something different. I mean, there's some very sweet scenes like when your parents come to New York and or I think you say in one part something that like you wish you could keep talking to them because you don't know them. You kind of
Yeah,
you see this
that's
door
true.
opening like, oh, these are actually interesting people who are probably
Yeah.
as rich and layered as I am, but you just don't have the time to pursue it.
It's not something you did back then, become friends with your parents.
Hmm.
Um, they were very much these authority figures.
It's sweet that
So,
your mom's like calling Elizabeth Hardwick and saying
yeah,
Merry Christmas and stuff. I mean, it's really very, I don't know. It's very sweet and um I want to say special. That's not the right word, but you really fell into quite a moment in time
yes, that's
and
very true.
yeah,
I
entangled a
think
lot of
about that a
lives.
lot. And, I mean, I think that probably youth is always a very good time. Um, but I think so much is hanging over people now, war and this thing we identify as climate poverty, uh, things we can't even see yet, that it does affect the sense of the future. And whatever we thought was going on then, uh, the future was always filled with possibility. And I don't know if the young feel that way now. I don't want to talk in the generalities about youth that used to drive me crazy. Um, but just these days, you get this kind of last summer of something before the whatever, and this feeling of waiting for something to happen has been with us for a while. That this sort of insecurity and
Yeah. And the
um,
disconnection. I mean, for me, it's again, I keep coming back to this relational thing of you actually being, because the book, it's so social. You're with people in all kind of complicated ways, trying to figure things out. And there's a kind of earnestness to it of trying to live life. And it gets messy and there's actually quite a lot of illness that comes eventually and stuff. It's not that I'm saying like we should put this on a pedestal as a way to live again, but there is an earnestness and an authenticity of connection, of human relation that I feel is harder now. I mean, COVID has something to do with it. When you're talking, I'm thinking about the kids who had to sit behind their screens
yeah, yeah,
and didn't go to school, and that really changes you. I've
yeah.
seen it in
Yeah.
kids of friends and stuff. It's not a
I mean, the only good thing about it is that it's a widely shared experience. So nobody's
so
a
you can
freak.
connect through it that way.
Yeah, you know,
Hmm.
it happened to people. The strange thing is, of course, our historical memory is so brief these days that there's things get put away before there's room for them.
Mm.
So everyone's living with a lot of baggage that is heavier than it need be.
I'm so glad you said that because that makes me think that that was actually the part of the thrill of wanting to be part of that scene of writers and stuff. It was this, and it's actually what I noticed so much in your book is that there's this kind of this transmission that's going on over time just through knowing one another and I think it can happen. I was going to ask you when I said, is life about who we know? Is it also who we read? Because I think it can also come through who you read. Like if you really read certain poets or
Oh,
authors
sure.
and you
Yeah.
really kind of know them in a way,
Yeah.
and then you kind of transmit that in whatever you do. That lineage, that connection, that
Yes.
feeling of time, which is really different from what you were just describing, that still is what motivates me. And,
Yeah.
you know,
There's a kind of reading that makes you feel close to this book or this work, and then maybe to a degree to the author at that moment. Not that you're going to go off and stalk anybody or sit
no,
by
it's just a
graves,
recognition that you
but it's a
can
kind of
then,
closeness because
yeah.
it's
Mm-hmm.
human contact. The reason we still read is to have this kind of enrichment by contact and learning something that you didn't know. So I think that's always very important. People who read are not as lonely as people who maybe don't. Um,
Yeah,
but
and it
no
keeps
way to
you,
test that one.
well, I've always there's a difference. Like when I know someone
There's
reads,
also what you read.
yeah, it's also what you read, but I think there's something about reading stories, narratives, and poetry. I mean, many things that what you're doing is sharing perspective with, so you're kind of, there's at least you're learning a kind of pattern or a habit of how to open yourself to new perspective. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
you're getting
there's,
outside yourself.
yeah,
Yeah,
and that
which
that
is
is a different kind of
more
way
people
of
need
being
to
in the
do
world.
these days.
Yeah, well, many people don't, right? We
You know, I'm
instead there's a
so
closing down
finished
of
with
pathways.
identity politics. And I don't want to sound like some right-wing person, but I think we need to embrace the universal, the concept of the universal again, our commonality, and stop with all these sort of competitive identities. I sometimes get the feeling that in the United States, the only authority you can speak from is that of the victim. And it's an imitation of the Black Civil Rights Movement, but it's also a misunderstanding of it. A lot of people who are coming off as victims aren't at all. This is crazy. It's sort of debasing who's really a victim. It's just a kind of part of power relations, to who's more convincingly a victim. And this is a disgrace to people who really are, but it's a sort of manipulation that is sort of everywhere
Hmm.
in America at the moment. And it's really tiresome, you know?
Yeah, and I think also for the people who engage in it, because just to try to, because I think when you're in it, it seems like what you're supposed to be doing. Sort of in the same way that if you look at certain people and they've made a lot of money or they have a lot of attention, you think that must be the way to do it. But if you're living in that phenomenology, it isn't actually what you would choose if you could know what it is. But and I think it's similar with these kind of what you're talking about. It almost feels like to be part of the group, to be accepted, you have to have a story like that. And it can almost feel like the farther you go with it, the more accepted you're going to be or the more attention you get until at some point you've actually lost yourself and you've become this story that you might have convinced yourself connected you to all these people, but somehow you're alienating yourself, you know? It's
Yeah,
actually the opposite of what I was trying to describe with that
yeah, exactly.
connecting. But I don't think people know they're getting into that. It's just you get like in that inertia where you feel like you have to do that if you're going to be cool or part of things or make some real
Well,
change in the world or whatever, you know?
it's like people, you have friends who feel the only way they can ask for your attention is to be always in crisis. And this is a bit like that. The only way that I can justify wanting to talk to the world is about a crisis, mine or yours or the world's. There's no other sort of register in which I can ask for your time, which is why we do like storytellers, because they're talking to us in another way.
And with
Um,
the story, you get what's, I think, missing in that, what you just described, which is you're these things are like portals, right? These experiences we have, when we share them with one another, we can, of course, like my experience isn't your experience, but when I'm reading your book, there's so many moments where I feel so connected to you, whether it's when you talk about your sister and her suffering from that. I didn't know that about your sister, and I've had that in my own family. So there's a line there where our patterns connected, which I wouldn't have had if I didn't spend the time with your book. And that's just one. There's many. But it
Well,
doesn't
well,
mean you and I,
thank you
it
for
doesn't mean you
reading
and
it,
I
by
like
the
share the
way.
same, it doesn't mean you and I share the same history or are ever gonna completely coincide. We have very different things, but it opens up a way for us to share paths, and then new paths
Yeah,
open. And
yeah.
when you're just like in the victim mindset, that opening is not there at all, right? It's either,
It's a competitive
yeah,
mindset. That's the problem with it. You're
yeah,
competing for attention as if it's a resource,
mm,
you know? Um, and as I said, there are stories that really are about people becoming victims that we should pay attention to.
yes, it's an important
But,
story,
you know,
important experience.
and I don't want to trivialize anyone else's trauma. So, um, I don't mean that everyone is free to tell his or her story. That's the point. Um, but I'm not interested in everyone's stories. I think I'm too much of a narcissist myself to
You
really
only want
sort
to
of
tell your
make
story,
room for someone else's trauma or something like that. I think that's why I'm not really on social media. I can't, you know, you have to make choices about what you read. This is one of the most painful things about running out of time.
Do you feel that now? You've said it a couple times. Are you
Yeah,
feeling
I do.
like you're
I
running
do.
out of time to do all the reading and all the?
Well, I feel like I'm running out of time and it doesn't make my character any better than it is. Doesn't make me any lazier or less spoiled than I have been. I order books and I live with hundreds of books I've not read yet. And I don't sort of get them in the evening instead of whatever it is one does on YouTube before sleep kind of knocks you out. Um, I watch sort of ridiculous things like people falling into water,
What? People falling into water.
stuff like that, pranks and fails.
I guess you need
That sort of
something
thing.
light.
Yes, yes. You know, I really have a terror of going to sleep with the last thing I've or seen or something. And
You have a tear.
also, YouTube has become my music delivery system.
Oh,
So
YouTube is
that's
great. I do think that a lot of these conversations are opening up through things like YouTube and podcasts
yeah.
and the music and stuff. There's a lot of new ways that people do find connection and share their
And they say
stories
it
in
doesn't
authentic ways.
burn as much energy as it used to.
Yeah, we have to figure
Uh,
that one out. But did you say you have
well,
a terror of going to sleep? Like you need to have the right thing to go to sleep or something? Is that what you mean? Like the right,
I don't like to go to sleep with the last thing I've read being
like a
about
negative?
Ukrainian soldiers
Yeah,
who
yeah, me
go
too.
into
Yeah.
hiding in order not to serve. I think it's so important to defeat Russia. And at the same time, I don't think Russian artists should be punished. Um, and St. Petersburg to me was one of the most beguiling cities. And I'm not a well-traveled person, but St. Petersburg, one of these places where the books jump out and start walking around. So I miss being able to go there.
Yeah,
Anyway,
I can't even get into that because it's just too
it's too
it's too
sad for
much.
words. And
But I'm glad we at least acknowledge it. It's another one of those
well,
things it's hard to get my head around right now that that's
well, there
actually
it's a lot of places.
normal life.
Darfur,
Yeah.
um,
Mm-hmm. And of course,
Gaza,
yeah, Gaza. Yeah.
you name it. Um, and I was thinking the other day, well, I never hear about Myanmar. It's not that those people have stopped. It's just that I don't read about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I
Everything else is taking over.
look up less and less in that way. I have the slight kind of falling behind with current events.
Hmm.
Mm, I don't really know who the new politicians in the UK are.
Hmm. That's
Yeah,
different for you. Gosh, I
that's
remember when you
very
were just
different.
knew every
Yeah,
little thing.
yeah. But I don't really have a sense of Keir Starmer or anything like that.
Well, I think as we, when you start to realize you have a certain amount of time, and also it's just like, what do you want to be thinking about and what sort of energy do you want to be living in? And
Yeah,
yeah, how much can you do something that's going to be productive? And then is it going to
yeah,
be productive to think about it all day and live in it and feel
yeah,
terrible? And like,
yeah.
probably not. So you have to find some
And
boundaries.
also, I find myself turning more about the past, reading literature from the past, uh,
Hmm.
trying to look for clues in the past. And if I'm able to do another book, uh, one of them would be trying to trace my family in slavery. Because the one thing about the white Pinckney family is that they were such big deals and such good business people. They kept very careful journals. And so I can find these
Oh, wow.
names going
That
back
would be good.
in the records.
I always wondered about that from
Yeah.
like the
And
high
they
continent.
make much more available
Hmm.
than there used to be.
Do you think of New York as home? I wonder
No,
what feels like home. Is it Indiana? Is it?
James.
Oh, yeah. You've
So
been together
wherever
so
James
long.
Land is, it's fine.
That's so sweet. It makes me think. Sontag said, "Where your books are," right? I think you say that in the book. Oh, is your home?
Yeah,
Well, where your
yeah,
James is your home. He's your
yeah,
book.
yeah, yeah,
You're in one of the most successful relationships I've seen over these. I've known you a long time. It's not like we talk every day or something, but I have seen that you and James were in love 15 years ago or whatever it was,
yeah.
and you still are. And yeah, it's kind of like
I
who
think it's
knew, right?
because we were
Berlin.
kind of old when we met.
You think that
He
was the
was
key?
40, I was 38, so
You were
a
ready.
lot had happened. And again, as I said, I just like those. So stuck with it.
Well, you're lucky. We are both lucky.
Yes.
There's something I have to ask you about before we go because it's the end of
Okay.
your book and it's got the word love in it. It's the Marianne Moore quote.
At the
Um,
end,
yeah. So
uh,
after everything we have loved is lost, then we revive. Isn't that the Marianne Moore? Yeah.
yeah.
Can you, I mean, after everything we have loved is lost, then we revive. It almost makes me want to think after everything we have desired or something, I mean, isn't the revival the love, or how do you see that quote?
I think the way Lizzie read it, which is that she means wisdom, you know. Uh, and I guess for Lizzie, that always went with the kind of stoicism, as the burden for seeing clearly. Um, that you can't act on it. It's just this deeper understanding you're stuck with from your life.
So that's kind of like what you were saying when how you were feeling when you met James. And that's philosophy
Oh, it was
in
feeling
a
a
way.
little different then.
Hmm?
I was feeling a little different.
Well, that's different, but it's also this. You said you were older, and so you had a
Yes.
certain kind of
Yeah.
there's a kind
About
of
that.
wisdom that allows you to be in a different place with someone.
Okay.
No?
No, I mean, yeah, you sometimes don't know what you want until you see it, and
Hmm.
then it's available.
Yeah.
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 Okay. Well, love of wisdom, though, I think goes into this why poets do what they do to you, too. There's some,
Um,
and it also probably ties into your family and all these things because you come from a family that's loves wisdom. And yeah. So,
they were into education. It was sort of one the real inheritance from slavery was education, the importance of it. I think that was a big deal.
that talented 10th kind of idea or
Well, I don't
more
know if
just
they,
appreciation of.
I don't, I mean, they certainly, I think a lot of, yeah, maybe, but they never came off quite that way, you know. Uh, I had a great, well, a great great grandfather who I've seen an affidavit that he couldn't write. So it's just his mark from 1898. And yet at the same time, 24 years earlier, he had the South Carolina legislature pass an act that changed his name from Limas to Limas Pinckney. In other words, he went out of his way to acquire the master's sort of name. All of his children, I think there were 13 from 2 marriages, I get the feeling went to school. And his son Limas, I have his copy of Milton's work, because when you graduated back then, the custom was to give you either the Bible or Milton.
Huh.
So I have this
Oh, wow.
this book, and he went to the Atlanta Baptist Seminary that eventually became Morehouse. And he was a minister in the South around Augusta, in Augusta, Georgia. And at a time when it's sort of like before World War One, young Black men were being lynched all over the South by the dozens. He got his sons out of the South into colleges in the North, and I don't know how he did it, but they went to Brown, they went to the University of Chicago, they went to Boston University, they went to the New England Conservatory for Music. Not his daughters, just his sons. And then he died early and unexpectedly. But I don't know how he did it. But I'm sure it comes from this kind of Reconstruction drive about education. And there must have been something like a Peabody Fund or Rosenwald Fund or something like that. I've been trying to find
It's really interesting.
the trace how he did it.
Yeah.
But that wasn't for reasons of talented 10th or anything like that. Well, maybe it was, because he sort of clearly thought they would do well, but it was to save their lives. And get them north.
It's a very different set of priorities. And
yeah, but to go that way north was a very different deal. So it was amazing. And he wasn't a rich guy.
Incredible. That's quite a story.
Yeah.
I think it's just we have to go because we've been talking, but there's just it feels so rich with the your family history, right? Coming in, and there's
but it's
all of
true
this,
for
what you're
every
talking
Black
about.
person. Every Black person has lived Black history through his or her family. You know, in every era or epoch, we all have someone who went through that.
All those decisions that, and then it's a different kind of knowledge.
Well, it's different kind of life
consciousness.
questions.
I mean, what about that idea of double consciousness? I wonder what you think about that. Like that. I mean,
I've always accepted it, but I've never found what we would call the gaze or being looked at. I've never found that very comfortable, and not just for racial reasons either.
I even wondered about the other, like the queer, the coming into the, like almost like a quadruple or triple, or there's many ways of this doubling. Or is there? I don't know.
No, there's only one way. It just comes down to cruising, or being in New York, and who's camera ready and who's not.
Well, okay, but I mean more, you have this amazing family history.
Yeah.
Then you have this Lowell kind of
detached from my
heritage
character, which only makes me care about.
Say it again.
And very detached from my own bad character, which only just makes me care about, being noticed by so and so.
No, but Darryl, really, I'm serious. Like,
I know.
Coming from where you did, I mean, maybe I'm making it too dramatic, but I just think of you coming out of this family, which is like kind of a very, I don't know if it's upper class or, I mean, my family wasn't that, like, well read and like you had some kind of pressure on you to be a man of knowledge.
Education more than class aspiration. I think education was part of the religion of citizenship. and it was something no one could take from you. Because as I said, nobody was rich
Hmm.
or particularly black bourgeoisie, but
But like the
they
story you
believed
just told,
in
yeah.
they believed in books. They really did.
So I see
They
you
believed
having
in
that
books.
richness, and then
Yeah,
you come into the
yeah,
Lowell richness, which he wasn't he
yeah.
like the from Samuel Johnson. I mean, there's this whole other kind of literary. I
Yeah,
can't
yeah,
remember it all, but I mean, it's
yeah,
like the
yeah,
most kind of literary background you can have.
yeah,
So then you're in that tradition. So you have these like two really rich and don't really exist, like at least that Lowell kind of classics trained Brahminish. I don't know what you really
yeah,
call it. That whole
yeah,
that was kind of really, I imagine it, that was like really full and still alive at that moment, but almost at the end. But
yes.
you kind of smush those together, and that's a kind of what I was thinking about with this doubling. But then also just being
Very true.
the queerness too, and so there's that doubling. So I'm kind of saying there's like many different ways in which you were getting different perspectives that
And
were,
that's the book.
yeah, that's the book, and that's
Thank
why
you.
you can only write the book because
No, you understood. I'm very pleased. You got it.
okay,
There were
so
these scenes were also influences and represented different literary traditions.
yeah,
Definitely.
yeah. And
Not
I think in
always
writing the book,
reconcilable.
you present it in a way that it can continue living. That's what I was trying to say about,
Ah, well, I hope.
you
That's
know.
kind. Thank you.
I think so though. It's because if you don't talk about it and write it, then it doesn't get transmitted and passed on. But if you do, it does, and you did. So yeah,
Okay.
no one else could have, right? Who else could have? Those two strands coming together. I don't know.
No, everybody has, writers get to where they are um, by different means, but by that are very similar at the same time. You know what I mean?
There's
Um,
patterns that connect,
things you need that different worlds can provide, I would say. You know.
and that's why that question of "Are you who you know? Are you the people that you are with?" is actually a really deep, rich question.
Yeah,
You know.
your chances often come from that, opportunities.
And
That's
just
what
what
New
you,
York was,
yeah,
that kind of mobility. And
and also what you gift to generations to come, because if you hadn't, you connected, I'm not trying to put you on a pedestal because we all do it in different ways and it matters for all of us, but in your case it is quite unusual, right, that you did leave a particular environment and bring it with you and enter another one and kind of you entangled some threads that probably normally wouldn't have been entangled in the same way, and it's like opening another path, that wouldn't have been there. I don't know really how to say that, but I think
I think I
that's
understood. That's
connected to all these other themes I've been talking about relations
yes,
and
yes.
history and community and opening
It's a very
back. And
generous way to read it. So thank you. But I
yep.
think you never know what results from sometimes it's very different from your intentions. But um, for one thing, I wanted to show these women as being to remember how smart they were. With this, they really were. And so, um, um, and not to sort of see them, I don't know. Uh, I wanted to say in a gossipy way, but of course it's full of gossip. So
Yeah,
I
well, you
don't
love
know.
gossip, don't you?
No, no. Um, and yes, these sort of different worlds that sort of didn't meet, but that um, had a claim on me.
Yeah,
Definitely. Yeah.
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 And you them too, I think.
Oh,
I think you gave them a lot too, probably. But yeah,
thank
of
you.
course, these are three of the most amazing women in kind of in New York.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
all right. Well,
Well,
I'm
again,
gonna,
my deep thanks.
yeah.
Thank you
Well,
so
thank
much.
you, Darryl.
Yeah. Yeah. It is nice to talk to you again.
Okay, nice to talk to
Anytime you ring, just let me know.
you. All right, yeah. Well,
And when
don't
you're
say
coming
that.
to New York, say hi.
Okay, I
Okay.
will. Same if you come to Netherlands. You
All
always
right.
have a place. Okay. Have a
Thank you,
great day there
Andrea.
or a good
You
afternoon.
too.
All right.
And have a
Bye.
good evening. And
Thanks.
thank you again from my heart. You're really very kind and generous reading of it.
I really mean
I'm
it. So,
very touched,
yeah.
really very touched.
Well,
So
good.
thank
I'm
you.
glad. Thank you for letting me
Me
talk
too.
about it and say all that.
Uh,
All right.
You're too
I give you a
much.
big hug. See you soon,
Same
I hope.
here.
All right.
Ciao.
Bye.